Welcome to the Sustainable Living Festival session, Coffee with Kevin and Joy. I'm Kelly Porter, Manager of Communications at Lincoln Electric System. This session is being recorded for later playback on les.com/fest. While you are in listen or view only mode, we encourage you to submit questions utilizing the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And a box will open up and you're able to submit your questions and hit send. So we are going to be talking today with Kevin Wailes and Joy Ditto. Joy Ditto became the American Public Power Association's president and CEO in January of 2020. Before that, she was president and CEO of Utilities Technology Council, a global trade association representing electric, gas, and water utilities on their mission-critical information and communications technologies. Before joining UTC, Joy was at the American Public Power Association for 15 years, rounding out her tenure as the Senior Vice President for Legislative and Political Affairs. Earlier, Joy spent 7 years on Capitol Hill as a legislative assistant to two representatives from Pennsylvania, Joe McDade and Don Sherwood, and Nebraska Senator Chuck Hagel. She was staff assistant to Senator John McCain in her first job out of college. Joy advised her bosses on issues involving natural resources, agriculture, trade, taxes, banking, the justice system, the environment, and energy. Joy is married with two daughters. She coaches youth soccer and is a competitive equestrian in the sport of eventing. Kevin Wailes, the CEO of Lincoln Electric System, has been immersed in the complex world of power transmission, distribution, and generation for decades. He started his career as an electrical engineer, was a superintendent for Lamar Utilities Board, a Colorado municipal electric utility, and then served the residents of Tallahassee, Florida as the utilities assistant director and eventually the general manager until joining LES 10 years ago. Kevin has served on several boards and councils related to the electric utility industry. He currently serves as the co-chair of the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. Kevin has 3 daughters, 2 dogs, and 20 beehives. He also holds a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo. Welcome, Kevin and Joy.
Kelly really identified we're going to do just some general comments from me, general comments from Joy, and then open it up for questions and answers. But certainly we know that the topic that we're all looking at right now is sustainability. It's a huge issue for the industry. And it's interesting, when I think about sustainability, I actually do think about public power. And you know, the thing about public power, and I'll weave this together, but public power has really 4 key elements from my perspective. One of those is locally owned, locally governed. In LES's case, for example, the city owns the utility. We have a semi-autonomous board of directors, 9 members that govern the utility. And that's different, obviously, from an investor-owned utility, which would have shareholders all over the country and be represented basically by the management, and their interests obviously are not only serving customers, but also providing a return to their shareholders.
What is it doing?
Kelly, you may want to mute.
Is it doing a lot?
Kelly, why don't you? So there's basically 4 parts associated with public power, and one of those is locally and locally governed. Another key part is reliability. And in LES's case, we have some of the highest reliability in the country. For example, it's some of the metrics we use, or what's the average outage time. In Tallahassee, it's less than 20 minutes. National average for that particular metric is over 120 minutes. So affordability, we do rate studies every year, and that's another key issue for us and our customers. And from an affordability perspective, we have historically been in the top 10 to 15 lowest rates of 100 cities we look at all over the country on overall rates. And then finally, I think a big key to this is what we call customer engagement, but it reflects back on everything we do. This is an example, but whether we're talking about budget, or we're talking about environmental programs, we're talking about our resource planning, we want to engage customers, because the key to the locally owned, locally governed part is the fact that we should be reflecting the values of the community and how we own and or how we operate and plan the utility. So that gets back to the sustainability component of what is really key. So if we move from there and talk just briefly about LES, we have 140,000 customers, and we are roughly the 23rd largest public power utility. And of that, there's about 2,000 public power systems in the country. So that's a relatively large utility. And when we look at the resources that we're serving, we have about 1,300 megawatts of power supply resources. And those power supply resources are really diverse. And that's one of the things we're very proud of when we talk about sustainability. They're roughly 1/3 renewables, 1/3 natural gas, and 1/3 coal. Now, the renewables are made up of a wide, diverse group as well. We have wind, we have hydropower, we have solar, we have landfill gas in the portfolio that makes up that 1/3. And the wind itself is actually diverse over several states. So when you look at our power supply resources overall on a combined basis, those resources are in effect across 6 states serving the city of Lincoln. And that provides diversity from several different aspects, both with respect to markets, as well as reliability and how we serve the customer. When we think about sustainability, one of the things that I think in a utility, typically what people think of, well, how much renewables do you have? And what kind of carbon output do you have with respect to CO2? And those are, I guess, the most obvious pieces. Well, for us, for example, our renewable portfolio right now, and actually since 2016, is equivalent to over 45% of our retail load. So, which is a pretty large amount of renewables. By the same token, we have reduced our carbon emissions from 2010 to 2019 by 42%. And in addition to that, we actually have reduced our what in effect is called carbon intensity, the amount of carbon we put out per megawatt hour of production, by roughly 38%. So what we've done over that period of time is pretty significant. We're not done, but it isn't just CO2 and renewables that make a huge difference when we're talking about sustainability for utilities. There's a whole bunch of things that roll up under that reflect, in many cases, the quality of life and how responsible we are with those generation resources. In our particular case, we have 2 different gas-fired plants in our footprint. One of them actually uses ice storage to help augment the power generation so that you can get more power out of it in the summer than you would without the ice. Therefore, you can build a smaller power plant and get more capacity. In another case, you have to have water for power plants. We use wastewater effluent for the cooling water rather than groundwater, which of course saves water resources. So there's a lot of innovation that goes into being sustainable, even though you may have fossil fuel resources. On the other hand, there's a lot of things that have to be done with respect to energy efficiency. We have the Sustainable Energy Program, which provides incentives for everything from lighting, high efficiency air conditioning, a variety of those. But as a part of that program, we also have a peak rewards program where we can be reimbursed for, in effect, paid to participate in a program where if you have an adjustable thermostat and we can control it, there's a few times a year we will do that in order to reduce peaks. Those types of programs are fairly extensive in trying to make sure we're finding the best way and most efficient way to serve the customers. On top of that, with respect to net metering, we do that with respect to if somebody wants to put solar on their house, but even more importantly than that, we have a renewable generation rate. And the renewable generation rate allows people to put in maybe their own neighborhood solar application and be paid for that and share the benefit of that with their neighbors. And then finally, or I shouldn't say finally, but one of the other key issues that we're looking at right now in order to lower the carbon footprint of the community and the country overall is electrification. And the big thing for that is electric vehicles. And I think all of us can see with respect to the pandemic that we've been experiencing, One of the things that came out of that is we saw when transportation went way down, the air quality went way up. Transportation is the single largest source of CO2. Of course, utility generation is the second, but it's a tougher issue for people to address, and how do you do that? So from an electric vehicle perspective, we've been doing a 2-year study that looks at, for example, what are the charging characteristics? How do people charge? And the reason that's important is it necessary to put an extensive charging network in the community, which we of course have a pretty robust one, or do people charge at home? And I think part of these series of webinars is providing some information from those studies as well. I believe there was one on Monday with respect to electric vehicles. But what we've learned out of that in sum total is most people charge their vehicles at home in our community that have those vehicles. So that changes the perspective of how do we make sure we best support that technology. And just a few other things that I think are important to note. We also have a couple of different interlocal agreements that are extraordinarily important for providing that same type of sustainability report to the community. One's called the District Energy Corporation. That's an interlocal agreement between the county and the city and LES that has district energy facilities that serve the West Haymarket, has district energy facilities that serve the jail, the adult detention center, the state prison. And these facilities are all of different designs, but to provide a more efficient way to provide heating and cooling. In many cases, we actually use ground source heat pumps. In some cases, they're just high efficiency central station. So that's one that benefits the community because all the entities participating in that are actually government, and therefore we're lowering their costs and improving the environmental footprint. The same thing goes with an interlocal agreement with the university called Newcorp, which facilitates providing higher efficiency assets to them and provides a way to provide that support. As a part of Newcorp, the university has put in 2 very large-scale thermal tanks in order to provide thermal storage and be able to use that during peak times. But I think that's a classic example of public power. We have encouraged and worked with them to do that. When those 2 tanks went online, that lowered the university's bill by $1 million a year. So that's money that goes back into the university that does not have to be supported. Now, when you think about that, that's a little interesting because that means if they're saving $1 million, LES is losing $1 million worth of revenue. But that's the key to public power. We're interested in finding the best way to serve our customers, whether they're institutions or they're individual, to find the best way and most efficient way to do that, the way to do it most environmentally responsibly. So as we move down this path of all the different things and examples I've given, now we're at a point where we're talking about, should we be setting a goal for decarbonization? And a lot of that's been driven because of feedback we've gotten from a number of customers saying, yeah, you've done a lot of really great things, but you really need to set a goal and put a target out there. So we've been in a fairly extensive process of working with our board, going through all of the issues that impact a goal and impact the utility and our customers, because we still have those key parts. Not only are we being environmentally responsible, but we have to be reliable and we have to be affordable. And we have to look at the long run and make sure that we're protecting our interests of all of our customers and being flexible while we do it. We expect that that process will take us to, in effect, setting a goal sometime roughly at the end of the year, most likely around November, October, November. And that process will also involve public meetings once we come up with the draft goal to make sure that we're sharing that, engaging with the community on that. So with that, Joy, I'm going to hand it over to you. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And I think I know that you've got a lot going on in Washington, and probably can only touch a little bit on that as it relates to sustainability, but please take it over.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks for having me. And I know this is supposed to be coffee with Kevin. I don't drink coffee very much. I drink soda, which is kind of poisonous to my body, but I love it. So I might have a little sip here before we get started, and hopefully you guys will too, because this should be an engaging conversation. I love what Kevin already said when we say my sip. A little caffeine jolt. You know, I really love what Kevin's already said about public power, and I'm just going to key off of some of that in describing what APPA is and how we fit into the mix of supporting public power, supporting sustainability. So I'm going to jump into that. So what is the American Public Power Association? Well, we've been around 80 years this year. And actually, I'm going to try to look at the camera. We'll see. I'm looking at Kevin's face, but I'm going to try to look at the camera right now. Let me change that perspective. So APPA has been around 80 years this year. We were formed in 1940, kind of on the brink of World War II, to ensure that the public power utilities that existed in the country at that point were able to support the war effort, or pending war effort, as we were kind of ramping up potentially into that. So some of our founding members were actually in the service while they were creating our founding principles and documents. And we would have loved to have been celebrating our 80-year anniversary if we could have a little bit more this year, but with COVID-19, things have sort of detracted from that celebration a bit. There are a little over 2,000 publicly owned utilities nationwide in 49 states, all but Hawaii. We also serve a few of the US territories. Most of our members are in communities, the vast majority are in communities of 10,000 people or less. So as Kevin mentioned, Lincoln Electric System is actually one of our larger public power utilities. We do have a handful of utilities that are pretty big by comparison, even to LES. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is our largest member with 1.5 million customers. And then we have a few others of that size, but the vast majority of our members are very small. And they are not for profit and were formed in the public interest. So we represent that group of folks. Our direct members, we have about 1,400 direct members, and the rest of the public power utilities typically are involved at the state level with their state associations, or at the regional level with regional organizations as well. So in terms of thinking about sustainability, I liked what Kevin said a lot. It's really, for us, we support our members as a trade association. We're located in the DC area. We're really here to advocate for our members in front of the federal government, but also provide platforms for our members to learn from each other, to knowledge share, also to set benchmarks and provide analyses of trends in the industry. And so when we're doing that, when we think of sustainability, we are undertaking a portfolio of activities here at APPA. So we're engaging in advocacy, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But we're also providing programs to help our members understand how they're benchmarked against each other. We just created, for example, a couple of years ago, the Smart Energy Provider Program, which is a way for public power utilities to be analyzed by their peers. So we have a panel of public power utility experts who analyze public power entities who have applied to be a smart energy provider. And that's looking at how they're addressing a variety of programs at the local level to create a smart, sustainable future. Distributed energy resources, energy efficiency, their power supply portfolio, et cetera, all factor into that designation of a smart energy provider. And we just started that up in the last couple of years, and we already have 90 utilities that have acquired that designation, and we'll continue to build on that. But as Kevin mentioned, we also want to make sure sustainability is not just about the environmental component and reducing greenhouse gas emissions or other air emissions, and having a less impact on our environment holistically, on our land, et cetera, our water. It's also about continuing to provide affordable and reliable power. So APPA for the last 20 years has had a certification program that's called the Reliable Public Power Provider, that allows our members to get certified around safety, reliability. You heard from Kevin how reliable LES is and how reliable public power is holistically as we benchmark against our fellow electric utilities, investor-owned utilities, and even rural electric cooperatives. We do very well in that regard. We also, for 40 years, have had a research and development program focused on smaller utilities that so that they can access funds for research and development and innovation in their communities. And we basically seed activities and also scholarships related to innovative ideas. And one of our grants that we provided one of our members who is involved in DEED years ago resulted in one of the very first, if not the first, wind farms that was run by a utility back in the early 90s in Iowa. So we have long been involved in that space as well. We also were involved in the Electric Power Research Institute, which is really geared toward larger utilities and R&D in that space, but we are involved there and partner with them as well. And one of the really cool things we've done recently, and that LES was involved with as well, is called the Power for Pollinators project that the Electric Power Research Institute is supporting, and we've supported financially as well. Which is really to look at our electric utility rights of way with our transmission and distribution lines and manage our vegetation such that we encourage pollinators like bees. And you know from Kevin's bio that he's very familiar with this. So we have encouraged that as well and supported that activity. And we look forward to more work in that space as we move forward. So the last thing I would say, there's a number of other programs and benchmarking and analysis we provide our members so that when they're looking at activities around sustainability, in terms of power supply, solar, community solar activities, electric vehicles, et cetera, we're really wanting to provide them resources and guides to help them as they analyze their particular circumstances locally. So we have a number of documents and guides that we have developed over the years and even more recently that do that, and I commend them to you on our website. So in addition to that, one of the recent things we've done, and this sort of leads into some of the trends, which is we partnered with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs to analyze our energy efficiency programs over the last couple of decades and benchmark them against the rest of the industry. And what we found, that report was released earlier this year, and we found what we suspected, which is public power is a leader in the energy efficiency, in energy efficiency vis-a-vis our fellow electric utilities. What has kind of differentiated us, according to that report, is that we have focused on the residential consumers' energy efficiency needs in our programs and in our incentives. But we've really focused on our commercial and industrial customers, where you can get a lot of energy efficiency bang out of the buck as well. So our overall energy efficiency is higher than our brethren in the rest of the industry so far. And again, it's a more holistic approach. We're working very closely with those commercial and industrial customers to help meet their needs and also to create a more energy efficient system. So in terms of trends, you heard from Kevin very impressive numbers about the reductions of greenhouse gas emissions that LES itself has experienced over the last 10 years or so, 9 years, Kevin, you said. When you look at the overall industry decrease, and this includes investor-owned, public power, and co-ops, we've seen a 25% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions since 2005. It's from 2005 to 2018. That's the last data we have, which is very significant. And many of those trends are related to, the shift from coal to natural gas. The natural gas has become much more plentiful. We've discovered ways to access natural gas here in North America more easily, and that's driven the price of natural gas down. So it's both a marketplace trend, but also a policy trend to move to natural gas, which, as you know, is 50% less greenhouse gas, that has 50% less greenhouse gas emissions than coal. We're also, though, leaders in hydropower and wind. In the public power sector specifically, we have more hydropower relative to our brethren. That is partially an ownership model. We have a number of hydropower facilities that we own, but we also purchase hydropower from the federal government in the form of the Federal Power Marketing Administrations. And we have long valued that low-cost hydropower, renewable hydropower. So that's a larger part of our portfolio. We've also been investing in, wind generation and solar generation. And in fact, much of our non-hydropower renewables that are coming online now and into the future is around solar. So moving on to, I would just also say in terms of kind of the policy arena, what we've seen is states, if you're looking at state targets or state mandates, they vary widely across the US. And partly because there is a variety of resource mixes across the US. In Nebraska, you all are blessed with good wind resources, not just in the state, but around you. in your neighboring states. And that's excellent. In other places, they're blessed with hydropower resources that I mentioned earlier. Others have access to more sun. But as we look, it really speaks to the need for diversity in our resource mix, because that goes into that reliability piece. If you're more beholden to one type of resource, if that resource fails in some way, it's very difficult to maintain reliability. Also, because wind and the sun are intermittent, meaning the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time, we have to build additional backup resources to ensure that we maintain reliability when the wind stops blowing. So we have to have that diversity. So all of these fuel mixes are still going to be important as we move into a lower carbon future. So in terms of, and I also will say before I move to kind of where we are at the federal level in terms of legislation and activities, what we've seen in terms of our own analysis is that as you go into really high levels, if you go into a zero carbon situation, like we've seen some proposals and I'll talk about, that by 2050, that price tag is much higher as opposed to looking at maybe a slightly lower target, like even 95%, 98%. The affordability, the cost goes exponentially up for those last few percentage points. And I think we've seen that in other targets we've had with regard to air emissions targets. The price tag goes much higher as you get to those last couple of percentage points. So I think we have to, as a country, as states, as individual utilities and communities, understand where those tipping points are, what we really can afford, and how much we're gaining, but to try to achieve those last couple of percentage points. And I think it's great hearing Kevin talk about what you guys are analyzing and what you're thinking about in terms of what Lincoln can do to address this issue and what makes sense for you as a community. And that moves into, as APPA, because we support and our members are units of local government that are really local control and local decision making is a major tenet of what public power is, as you heard from Kevin already. We are reticent at APPA and at the federal level to support mandates that are one-size-fits-all mandates. We tend to say there's more nuance here. Let's give a target or a goal and provide a lot of flexibility so that our members can achieve that goal without really prescriptive mandates. Having said that, our members over the last 15 years or so have been discussing climate change legislation and what our position is on that. And just earlier this year, our members voted in a policy resolution. That's how we develop our policies, is we provide a resolution kind of with whereas clauses. And so we approved a policy resolution that updates our climate change policy and says that we proactively support federal legislation around climate change. So even though that sounds like a one-size-fits-all, I think our view is that if we can get the right mix of specifics in that type of federal legislation, then it would give more certainty and more ability to plan as our members tackle this issue. So having said that, to get to climate change legislation that we would support that grants us that flexibility, we're not sure that we can get that, but that's what we would be working toward in climate change legislation that's pending. But it's not all about climate change legislation. There's also infrastructure matters that we care about. One of the things that's really important to us as we look at our generation portfolio is much of the time at the federal level, the federal government incentivizes new resources, innovative resources with tax credits, with using the tax code to create that incentive. Well, because we are not for profit, we cannot take advantage of tax incentives. We don't pay federal taxes. We pay payments in lieu of taxes to our communities. We contribute to the general funds of our communities, but we don't pay federal taxes. So to give us a tax credit is not helpful to incentivize us getting into a new or innovative activity like electric vehicles, or like back in the day, wind, and even still, providing incentives for solar production, et cetera. So we have asked for what we call comparable incentives to make us whole in that regard. Because what's happened is, because we don't have those same incentives, we haven't always generated our own renewable energy, because renewable energy like wind and solar has been the beneficiary of federal tax incentives. So developers of those resources can use that tax incentive. We can't. So we've been in the mode of having to develop what are called purchase power agreements and purchase from developers and others these resources. It would be better for our communities if we could control them ourselves, or build them ourselves, or partner with other public power utilities to build them. So that's been a long-standing policy priority for us at APPA, is to get those comparable incentives. So we want federal climate change legislation that's reasonable, that is economy-wide. We also want comparable incentives to go with any kind of climate legislation, or really any energy legislation should include these comparable incentives. And then we also support things like other incentives, grants for electric vehicle infrastructure, rebates, things like that, that would benefit customers, not just ourselves. So in terms of federal legislation that's pending, as I think all of you know, there's a diversity of opinion in Congress. You have the House that's controlled by Democrats, who are very strong on pushing forward climate change legislation that in really many cases, or most cases, would be zero carbon emissions by 2020. So we've seen a lot of activity since the House was taken over by Democrats. Many hearings, reports, outreach to stakeholders, and APPA has participated in all of that. On the Senate side, that it's controlled by Republicans, the approach has been, there's still interest in addressing the issue, but in the form of ensuring that affordability is maintained, looking at what's already happened, what's made the carbon reductions that have happened so far, what's made that happen, how can we continue to spur that kind of activity, as well as looking at carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And that's been a real tough nut to crack, I think. So as you know, natural gas produces carbon emissions, coal produces carbon emissions, and for many years we have sought to reduce those carbon emissions by capturing and storing, or otherwise utilizing that carbon. And it's been, again, a tough nut to crack from an affordability standpoint, but it's something we still support. So in the Senate, there's been a focus on that piece as well. But where we stand with legislation is that there has been a big package that was passed just recently in the House that incorporates a bunch of infrastructure related items and tax related items, as well as climate change legislation that is really a clean energy standard that would be a zero emission standard by 2050. That's called the Moving Forward Act, or HR2, and that's not going anywhere in the Senate, at least in the short term. But it does include some of provisions that we care about at APPA and in public power around that comparable incentive piece I talked about earlier, to help us develop our own clean energy future. And also it includes some provisions for incentivizing electric vehicles. So there are elements of that bill we support. We don't support the entire package, but we have supported elements and have appreciated working with the House on that. But again, that package is not going anywhere in the short term, at least. And then there was another energy related bill that came up earlier this year in the Senate, and it stalled, unfortunately, because of an unrelated issue. But that was called the American Energy Innovation Act, and it was sponsored by the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, Lisa Murkowski. And we also supported that bill. It did not provide a clean energy standard or zero emission standard, but it did provide incentives for nuclear power and other clean energy production and R&D for innovative technologies and electric vehicles and some other things we supported. So with that, what's going to happen? I think a lot is dependent on the elections, and that's no surprise to folks on the call. If the Senate flips to Democratic control, then we could easily see climate change. It depends on the numbers. There's still a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. If you have 60, So that means that you could actually control the agenda. There are some rules that have been changed recently that allow you to kind of get around filibusters, and that could be deployed. But certainly if Democrats take over the Senate, there's a great chance that climate change legislation could pass in the shorter term, even as early as next year. If the White House flips, then that would get signed into law because the candidate Joe Biden has indicated his support for many of these ideas that have already been put forward in the House. So there could be a really quick, depending on the outcome of the election, there could be really quick activity and action on climate change. And we have really been developing relationships and putting forth our ideas for many months around these issues. So we're ready to tackle whatever legislation may come down the pike. So that could happen. Obviously, if things sort of stay steady state, I think we're just going to continue to see some smaller bites of the apple. I mean, maybe if nothing changes, we could potentially see, as part of additional sort of stimulus bills related to COVID-19, we could still see some of these tax-related matters continue to come up, and pieces of an infrastructure bill certainly are being looked at by both sides of the aisle. So that could be part of what we see going forward if nothing changes in the election in terms of the leadership of the Senate and the House. And then certainly if the Senate stays Republican, the House stays Democrat, but the White House flips, the dynamic depends on the numbers in the Senate, but the dynamic is still probably the same in the sense that there might be some things on the margin that get done in this space, particularly with regard to infrastructure, but probably not major climate change legislation. So I'm not going to put on my, I'm not going to try to predict how that may play out. You all have your own opinions and can look at polling, but we're prepared for any of those outcomes. So with that, I think, Kevin, I hit on most of the things you wanted me to talk about today, and I'm happy to answer questions from you or from anyone else.
Thanks, Joy. One of the things, just briefly before while folks are putting some questions in, is you referenced the Smart Energy Program, the RP3, the Reliable Public Power Provider Program. In all cases, we have achieved those designations as well. In fact, to have the highest one, for example, for the RP3 program. We're a member of DEED. In fact, DEED helped fund, for example, different projects we've done, including the electric vehicle study we referred to. And on top of that, we actually are members of the Electric Power Research Institute as well. So all of those things, as you mentioned, kind of go together with respect to folding into not only what public power does and is, but also how sustainability itself is a key output of all those things. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. You guys I'll just say for the audience, LES is just a leader. It's why we nominated Kevin to be one of our key representatives on this really key group called the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council that you heard about earlier. And I'm used to talking to him about resilience and response and pandemic response. So it's actually fun to get to talk about something else, Kevin, with you. But LES is a leader, Kevin's a leader in our industry. So thanks for pointing out that you have, I should have said it already. I'm not surprised. I kind of just assumed everyone knew how great LES was already, but really, really a huge leader. One of the things that I just, as you were talking, I forgot to mention, which is this piece, which is as we continue to evolve our sustainable future, some of that evolution is around more activity from our customers in regard to distributed energy resources and solar rooftop and storage and electric vehicle charging on the premises, and maybe even putting some of that back onto the grid. And as we look to that future utility model that is part of that sustainability picture, we do need to understand really well what the technology is related to deploying that kind of granularity on our distribution system requires us to really have great situational awareness into what resources are coming back onto the grid. And that is enabled by technology. But that technology comes with a risk, which is the cybersecurity risk, because the technology is sort of internet based. Not it's our own intranet, but it's really on a network, and we have to be able to protect those networks and the equipment that we use to see our systems at a granular level from cybersecurity threats. So as we continue this evolution into greater sustainability, greater innovation, kind of grid of the future, and deploy technologies to help us do that, which are essential and we couldn't do without those technologies, we have to be mindful that we're also dealing with that cybersecurity risk at the same time, and we'll need to be doing that into the future. So I just wanted to mention that too, because it reminded me about our ESCC work.
We do have a question really relating to the historically low natural gas prices, how that's going to play into the future going forward, as well as what challenge that's going to be in trying to get people off of natural gas for heating when it's so low and moving to electricity as a part of electrification. And I think it's a good point, because we all know that right now natural gas is considered the crossover fuel in the transition to a lower carbon economy. And until we see significant energy storage capability, natural gas is a key part of that. And or if we see potentially modular nuclear reactors in a smaller type of, less expensive way to approach nuclear power, natural gas is going to be key. I think one of the things that we see as a trend with respect to that question of whether it's going to be a challenge for heating in the competition for using electricity as opposed to natural gas, I think one of the things that we're beginning to see is trends of regulatory mandates saying that there is no more, natural gas can't be used for those types of applications. And I think not unlike the comments Joy made relating to the legislation, I think we're going to see a lot of different regulatory impacts trying to address carbon legislation, or basically decarbonization. And if in fact the economics aren't there, there's still going to be incentives or regulatory criteria put in to make us move there. So I don't really have any thoughts on that.
I would just maybe take a step back and say, natural gas is a critical part of our portfolio at the moment, and if we are going to eventually get to a much lower carbon footprint, I hope that we can find a way, either through carbon capture, utilization, and storage, to continue to use natural gas, because it is it's a resource that backs up that intermittent power, like you were saying. And unless we're able to put in a vast amount of nuclear or hydropower, we just don't have that base load, day-to-day, 24/7 reliability capability from other resources. So I think it's a good thing that natural gas is cheap right now, in the sense that helps our economy get back on track, potentially. It helps us keep rates lower. We are facing challenges because of COVID-19, and I think us having part of our power supply be from that resource that is maintaining those low cost amounts is actually a good thing for the short term. But I'm not sure, if that's if those prices will stay low in the longer term. It's unclear to me. I mean, I know we have a pretty great supply of natural gas, but I have no idea what the marketplace may do in the future. And certainly there's a need for natural gas elsewhere outside of the electric sector. So, I don't really have an answer in terms of how to get people off of kind of home heating with natural gas at this point, given those price points that we're talking about in the Northeast. But I do see it as a critical component of our future in the electric sector for at least the foreseeable future, until there's alternatives.
Joy, we don't have any questions right now, so I may pose one. One of the references you did not make relating to APPA's activities is actually the importance of the representation and basically interface with some of the federal agencies like the Department of Energy. What do you see with respect to between the emphasis on infrastructure bills, things going on with the Department of Energy? Do you see some concerted effort in funding for large-scale storage that might help move make that transition, given the fact, I think it's pretty commonly understood in our industry that that's kind of the holy grail of trying to integrate many of the renewables into firming them up as a resource.
Certainly, and that is, there's definitely incentives for storage and the bills I've been mentioning, and that's a great point. I think there's a huge amount of focus on storage technologies at the Department of Energy. You know, even regardless of administrations, it's seen as a real key to what you just described. And so that's something we support heavily and will continue to support. And if we, you know, one of the things we want to do with our DEED program is really expand it into more partnerships with the federal government. So far, we have done it with our own monies through our donations from our members, and kind of with the exception of some work on cybersecurity, we have been less inclined to take federal money, but we're looking at ways to partner when there is federal money available. And really because our program is less about the pure R&D and it's more about RD&D. It's actually applying that idea to a utility environment. And so we're actually looking at ways to partner with DOE in this space, and energy storage will be a key one for us to see if we can get some bigger seed money than we have in our current DEED program to do some of those partnerships. So certainly it's on our minds. It's a huge part, and we have good relationships with the energy storage community. And I see that as a big forward-looking activity.
At this time, if anybody would like to ask Kevin or Joy a question, you just need to click the icon at the bottom of your screen to submit a question. We did have some that were sent to us prior to this meeting, and one was in regards to microgrids. What role do microgrids have in the electric industry, and what's on the horizon?
Kevin, you want to answer that first? Or
Yeah.
you want to
Yeah, I might, because in fact, I think it was just last Friday where, we had a presentation at the board meeting about a microgrid concept we're deploying in Lincoln. And I think one of the things sometimes that seems to be a kind of a misunderstanding. I think people think microgrids mean you've got a self-sustained area or entity that is served only by renewable energy. And of course, one of the things, and I think that point was made well by Scott last Friday, was virtually all the microgrids have, in effect, a fossil fuel resource that's providing that reliability, in many cases supplemented by renewables or storage. And really the microgrids themselves are in effect a resiliency component and very key. And it's one, I think it's a technology that in my mind, it's actually where you're taking a look at what public power grew up, in effect, in my mind, as doing microgrids, because cities all over this country, many of those in Nebraska, ended up, not having the power they needed. They had little power plants, and that's how they were doing it. They, in effect, were microgrids themselves until they could be interconnected to the grid. We've now moved on and applied that to using it for resiliency in the event of natural disasters or even a potentially catastrophic attack on the grid itself, to have preparations and ways to be able to do that. So clearly it's, I think, a good tool, but sometimes I think there's a misunderstanding, at least with today's technology, how it's applied.
I can agree more. I'll just add that, I think there's a lot of interest kind of in the Department of Defense about using, if you're a military base, being able to kind of use that concept, microgrid, some of that redundancy, using various technologies to create a microgrid if you need to, in an event like you described, in a national security emergency or resilience situation. And I think for what I've seen in our sector is when we're looking at microgrids, it does offer an opportunity to test, to look at some of these various technologies that are new or that integrate together, and using those networked sensors, other capabilities where you can manage your systems with the technology and on a network. That's a benefit of a microgrid, because you can sort of test how that's working. And a lot of utilities develop, put together their own kind of model microgrid to test that capability before deploying it in the field. So it's certainly microgrids, as Kevin said, have a major role to play. But I agree with him that sometimes there's a lack of clarity on what that actually means. The other thing you said I loved, which is we're kind of going back to the future. I mean, public power was the original microgrid and the original kind of utility of the future. We are close to our customers. We have great relationships with all of our customer classes, our residential, commercial, and industrial customers. And that really is what the future grid looks like. It's developing those relationships at a more granular level, having that conversation operationally as well as relationally. And that's what we do best. And I really see us as pioneers in that regard. So it's really kind of exciting, I think. And I keep looking at Kevin and not looking in the camera. I'm making a huge Zoom mistake.
We both have that problem.
I can't help it. I like looking at people's faces.
That's okay. That's okay. Another question that was submitted ahead of time was, and maybe Kevin can get us started, and then Joy, but just kind of in the discussions that those of us who are public power have with our community members, there seems to be a disconnect between capacity and energy use, especially when we're talking about numbers and percentages. Can you dive a little bit further into that difference for us?
Yeah, you know, you're right. And I think we all think of different ways to try to describe what the difference is between capacity and energy. You know, capacity clearly is an instantaneous measurement of how much power is, for example, either able to be provided or be able to be used at any instant or over a discrete period of time. So we refer to, for example, our peak demand is approximately 800 megawatts. You know, I think one of the things that megawatts, we all have in the industry, and engineers have a tendency to really like talking about megawatts. And unfortunately, I think in many cases, our customers go, what the heck are they talking about? And you know, if you think about it, I think a good way to think about the instantaneous demand needed is that hot summer day when everybody's air conditioning is going. That's going to be that demand component. And a good way to think about a megawatt, for example, is a really large Walmart is about a megawatt demand customer, for example. And then if you go on the other end of that, and you're saying we have Casey's convenience stores here, you know, they're probably about 1/10 of a megawatt, for example, in how much capacity. And a megawatt's 1,000 watt or 1,000 kilowatts. So it gives you some perspective. Now, our large customers, and if you, let's say Kawasaki Manufacturing is about a 10 megawatt customer. If you want to put it in a perspective of us being 800 megawatts, and you think about other towns in Nebraska, the city of Fremont is about 100 megawatts. So there's, if you think about that corresponding, that gives you the demand or capacity component, so that we have to have enough power anytime everybody's running all their air conditioning to be able to meet that. But it's, when we talk about energy, we're talking about how much energy over time. And so that's basically adding megawatts to time. And that means that the amount of energy over time that it takes. So that customer that may be 100 kW or 1 megawatt at that instant of time in the summer, they may, in their off-peak time, may only be a half that. Well, that is then the time difference of that. When you multiply that all out, that's energy. That's in effect how much energy we have to provide. And so when we talk about renewables, the difference between capacity and energy is best thought about for wind, for example. You don't exactly know when it's going to blow, but sometimes it's going to be blowing at peak capacity and sometimes it's not. And so in many cases, the capacity you can rely on from wind under our markets is saying about 10%. And I think that's important because if you think about, for example, we have about 300 megawatts of wind. So that means we only get to count, for the purposes of meeting our peak resource, our peak load, we only get to count, let's say, 30 megawatts of that. All right. So if you're thinking, and that's out of 300. And so but on the other hand, it produces a lot more energy than that. So if all we had was wind to try to serve, let's say, our entire load, well, you can imagine that if you think about a 10% and we're roughly at 800 kW peak, well, then you can easily see that what ends up coming up is so much wind and then you'd have a whole bunch of energy that you in fact can't deal with because there's too much energy generated and no place to take it. So the whole capacity energy issue is a very tough one when we're dealing with renewable resources, and particularly wind, because it produces a lot of energy but doesn't necessarily get a firm allocation or does not get to count for meeting that peak load. And that's one of those reasons that storage is such a key part.
Thank you, Kevin. We did have another question that came in. What goals for future renewable energy does LES plan to contribute? Given the current rate of adopting renewable energy investments, can we expect to be 50% renewable within 10 years?
Well, currently, we're approaching 50% of our energy, producing the equivalent of 50% of our retail energy with renewables right now. So we've really almost attained that reference. And we have looked at it basically in part because of the question you said with respect to capacity and energy. We're not thinking that renewable goals are effective, but what we're looking at is looking at some type of goal with respect to, in effect, carbon output and how we're moving toward decarbonization.
Great. The next question, and I'll ask Joy, in your professional opinion, what are the two largest challenges facing the utility industry in the forthcoming future, with some research, common challenges this person has noticed, including aging infrastructure, implementation of renewable sources, grid security from cyber attacks, etc.?
It's a great question. So let me see if I can hone it down into two. I mean, I think really the issue is, I'll say our biggest challenge is education, our number one challenge, because of what Kevin was describing, the complexity of deploying electricity instantaneously so that the lights go on. There's a lot of misunderstanding about how that works still. And there's been a misunderstanding for decades until we started looking at these alternative forms of generation that had some challenges but have this sustainability component. So we didn't really do a great job, I think, as an industry in terms of that education piece. I think if we can get that right, and there can be a greater understanding of how we operate our systems, and we can develop a partnership with our customers around how do we get to the goals that we all agree on optimally. If we can do that, then we can solve some of the cost problems instead of just saying, well, renewables are good. Well, what's our goal? Is our goal to reduce greenhouse gases? And if so, what are the components we need to do to achieve that goal, rather than giving us a front end, very prescriptive way of. So I think if we can get that education component, policymakers, our customers, that's a huge challenge for us. And I think if we can lock arms with our brethren in the other parts of the industry to do that, that would be great. And Kelly, I know you're a communicator, so you can help us with that. That's one big challenge, I think. And then, I think we alluded to it earlier, which is it's a challenge and an opportunity. So much of what we do is both. And I think the opportunity, and it's true in the education side too, the challenge, the second big challenge is kind of was alluded to, I think, in the question, is as we deploy technology to enable, so, network technology equipment that is on a network that people in China can potentially access, what does that supply chain look like for the equipment? How do we deploy it with cybersecurity baked in so that we can continue to rely on our grids, but we can make those grids much more flexible and functional, and can achieve the sustainability goals, can achieve the kind of independence goals that some of our customers want to do with their own energy kind of in their homes. And we can integrate storage and do all these things affordably. It really does a lot rely on technology deployment, and also the educational component of how much is that going to cost and what is that cost benefit analysis of the technology. I think those two things, again, challenges and opportunities in both arenas. And I really I hope we can achieve those goals of the education and the technology deployment optimally.
Kevin, kind of the same question to you. What do you feel are the largest challenges facing our industry today?
Well, I think it dovetails with what Joy said. You know, we have extraordinary challenges to make sure that we're trying to address decarbonization at the same time maintaining reliability and affordability. And that's kind of stepping back from the global piece. So that's both an education issue, that's a technology issue. It's also a sunk investment issue for trying to deal with the assets we have. I know there's, you know, we hear a lot of times this comment about deterioration of the grid. You know, you hear people make a term, it's a third world grid. I don't think people understand how reliable and the redundancy that's in the grid. Are there portions of different utility systems that need to be addressed? Yes. Most of the folks that watch our budget and everything know how much money we put into basically addressing aging infrastructure. I mean, it's a huge issue. It's a huge budget issue for us. And it ranges from cable replacement of older cable to transmission and restoring that. The industry in general does that. I think public power does it a little better because we have different concepts of how we're addressing our infrastructure. We have different regulatory concerns, but the industry overall is, you know, the grid's extraordinarily reliable, but that doesn't mean that we don't have aging infrastructure that we have to deal with as we move forward because of cost. So I think all those pieces are there. I see we're close to running out of time, and I wanted to tell one quick anecdote for Joy and kind of everybody. Since I've been in Tallahassee, or been in Lincoln for 10 years. When I was first here, Mark Cresson was the CEO of APPA, and Mark came to visit. In fact, that was when Joy was on staff. He was in Lincoln to speak at an energy, one of our energy summits. And I'll never forget his comment when he got to Lincoln and we were having dinner the night before. He said, you know, coming to Lincoln, Nebraska is like visiting the mothership. And of course, since Nebraska is all public power and Lincoln is the capital. So Joy, I just wanted to thank you for joining the mothership for a little while.
That's perfect.
You can come back in real time as well.
I will be there whenever I can be. I would love to see you all in person, but thank you for including me in this so much. And I agree. You guys are the mothership, and you're such supporters of public power and exemplify who we are and what we do. So thanks again for your leadership, Kevin. Thanks, Kelly. And talk to you soon.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Well, enjoy to kind of also welcome you into the Husker fold. We have a Husker mask coming your way, so you can feel like part of the family when you're in DC.
Appreciate it.
So thank you both to you and to Kevin for providing your insights today. I think all of our attendees will agree with me that it was extremely valuable. So we appreciate you being here. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us for our Sustainable Living Festival session. I just ask, once you all close out of the session, go ahead and take the brief survey that'll pop up. This just allows us to serve you better and to get some valuable feedback. So again, thank you. We will continue our Sustainable Living Festival the rest of the week. There's more sessions and activities available on las.com/fest. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks.